Before we get started with this episode, I want to jump in here and give an important announcement. It's been just over a year since my bishop told me to pause the podcast, coming in the form of a letter in which the ACNA's archbishop, three other ACNA bishops, and a number of senior priests in my diocese were carbon copied. This letter culminated in a July 9th, 2024 meeting with my bishop that didn't go so well and caused me to take more than a month to discern whether or not I should or even could continue telling the story of abuse survivors within my denomination. If you want to know more about this story, feel free to look back at previous episodes. After all this time has passed, and along with some recent developments, I've realized the Anglican Church of North America is no longer a place where I belong, or that I even need to be a part of. I'm hoping to explain more about those developments at some point, but one of my major realizations was that continuing to do the podcast puts me at complete odds with my bishop, my diocese, and with much of the ACNA leadership. I'm sure there are many priests, deacons, and pastors who are silently offering their support, listening to these episodes and prayerfully waiting for Bishop Ruch's trial to take place. But relationally speaking, and practically speaking in terms of any ministry work I might be called to do, the ACNA is not an organization nor a culture wherein I can work, nor that would want me anyway. I don't say any of that with a woe is me mindset. It is deeply grieving and bewildering, though. To be fair, I don't want to work with them anymore either, so it's a mutual parting of ways. A few weeks ago, I sent a formal letter of resignation to my bishop through the Diocese of Quincy's Canon to the Ordinary. Here, I'll read it to you now. You can tell me if I did it the correct way. June 13th, 2025. Dear Bishop Morales, after discernment, prayer, and counsel, and according to Title 3, Canon 6, Section 4 of the Canons of the ACNA, I am writing to formally make a voluntary resignation from ordained ministry in the Diocese of Quincy and the Anglican Church in North America. This is not a renunciation of my priestly ministry and vows, but a voluntary resignation from the institution itself. Whereas, there has been a breakdown in relationship, both personal and ecclesial, without resolution for the past year. There is not another ACNA bishop or diocese willing to take me in, nor is there one I am pursuing. I am not in active ministry within a Quincy congregation at present, and do not believe I will be doing so in the foreseeable future. You have communicated to me that the Wall of Silence podcast does not fit into the mission of the diocese, and based on your communication with me, I would now be in active disobedience to you by going ahead with producing the podcast, but with me being in disagreement with that assertion while being unable to address it and work through it. I believe it is best, both for myself, for you as bishop, and for the diocese, that I formally resign. Thank you for the opportunity to serve in the Diocese of Quincy and be a minister of the gospel of Jesus. With sincerity, Chris Marchand. So there you go. I'm no longer a priest in the Anglican Church in North America. I imagine there are other proceedings that need to take place in the background, but I resigned. I'm still very much discerning where I'll land as far as ministry and ordination goes, while also being very much committed to the local church I'm currently attending. But note that the disclaimer I have been making about my bishop and my diocese at the beginning of each episode no longer applies, so I won't be including it anymore. With that, let's get to our current episode. This is the Wall of Silence podcast, the ACNA 2 story. An account of church abuse and cover-up in the Anglican Church in North America, of things done and left undone, and why we should care about it. This is episode 13, the presentment of Bishop Stewart Ruch, part 3, the Bishop's Presentment. A disclaimer. This episode contains general references to sexual abuse, the sexual and physical abuse of children, as well as to domestic violence. Also, if you have a conflict of interest regarding Bishop Ruch's presentment trial, it is my recommendation that you not listen to this episode until after the trial is completed. This specifically applies to those on the provincial tribunal, the court for the trial of a bishop, or if you are working with the trial in any related capacity. Although we said this episode would feature the story and thoughts of Sam Lacey, one of the writers of the lay-led presentment against Bishop Stewart Ruch, we decided instead it would be important to first give an overview of the bishop's presentment against Ruch. This had very briefly been officially released by the Anglican Church in North America on June 11th, 2025. However, after viewing this presentment, which prior to this had not been released to the public, ACNA2 noted that, to quote from their article about the presentment, it contained, quote, inappropriate identifying details and false information, which led to the ACNA pulling the presentment from their trial update page, when ACNA2 addressed it with them. As of the release of this episode, the presentment has not been reposted officially in any form within the ACNA, and thus ACNA2 took it upon themselves to repost it in a redacted version. To quote from them, redacting any individual's case where there is a question regarding the supervisory relationship of the persons involved. This episode features a discussion with 4 ACNA2 members going over the significant details of this presentment and what their takeaways from it are. I recommend reading the article on their website first, if possible, which I linked in this episode's show notes, but can also easily be found if you do an internet search for ACNA2, the Bishop's Presentment, and Stewart Ruch. At the bottom of their article, they link to the redacted version of the actual PDF of the presentment. For people in the ACNA, I think it's significant to note the bishops who signed the presentment. These are Bishop Chuck Gillen of the Diocese of the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, Bishop Todd Hunter of the Diocese of Churches for the Sake of Others, and Bishop Ken Ross of the Diocese of the Rocky Mountains. Todd Hunter, for reasons that still remain mostly unclear to me other than that my former bishop claimed he is a friend of his, was one of the bishops CC'd onto the letter my bishop sent me, calling for me to pause or stop the podcast. The ACNA2 members who joined me for this discussion are Abby Nye, Audrey Lumen, Connor Hansen, and Whitney Evans Harrison. The first question I have, and it's what I was curious about when it immediately came out and you all let me know about it, is, wait, has this been available to the public before? And so how can you explain that, especially since some of you helped to write the lay-led presentment? So was any of this available beforehand? How do you explain the background of that?
Yeah, this presentment was completely private. We did not know. Even the authors of the lay-led presentment back in February and March of 2023, we had heard the faintest of rumors that there might have been a presentment turned in by 3 bishops. We didn't know which 3 bishops. We didn't have any confirmation. And when we poked around a little bit, it was very tight-lipped. So we could never get that confirmation. So we had to operate with the assumption that nothing has happened at all, and we're going to go ahead and write a presentment and turn it in. We had to figure out how to do that and look into canon law. And so even once we turned in June and Foley Beach went public, exposing that there had been this appeal by Stewart Ruch and the stay order granted by the tribunal, even then, it was very tight-lipped. You know, there is a presentment, but we can't see it. We don't know how long it is. We don't know what its contents are. We don't know what it's based off of, what evidence it's using, what accusations are made, and what charges are brought. So this was a huge bombshell to wake up a couple weeks ago and find it right there.
What did you make of that then? I guess my question would be, you told me about it. Abby, you also used that word, bombshell, but it just kind of came out of nowhere. And then also, I guess maybe it's good to speak to this. You have now reposted it, which is also what you did with the Hush Blackwell report. It's another redacted version. As far as I know, as of the recording of this today, it's not been made available online. So what do you make of that, of releasing it as they did, and then you had to contact them again and say, listen, there's victims' names in here. and then they take it down. And now you've offered a redacted version. How can you speak to all that? Abby, go ahead.
I think the reason I used the word bombshell when I was sharing it with you is because it contains so much information that has not been publicly available previously. It didn't really contain any new information that we didn't already know as the ACNA2 team, because people share a lot of information with us that never becomes public. But this is the first time that the public was seeing, names that only we knew about. And I do want to give credit where credit is due. Like, I do think the province should be releasing this kind of information. Like, we should be able to see the presentments. The trial should be public. All of the documentation should be public. As somebody who's a state employee at a public university, I feel very strongly that these types of things can and should be public. But as we saw with the Hush Blackwell report, the province did not do their due diligence in properly redacting the documents. And so we immediately reached out to them and said, would you please take this down until you can properly redact it? And as with the Hush Blackwell report, after a period of time where they had not put up a properly redacted version, we thought this is really important for the public to see because the trial is so quickly approaching. So we will make a redacted copy and re-release it.
And one thing I'd like to piggyback off of on that is one of the reasons that we thought was so important for making sure this information stayed public is how much the charges mirrored each other within those two presentments. Like Audrey said earlier, the authors of the lay presentment may have had a vague knowledge that a earlier presentment existed, but none of the contents of that were made public. So the fact that both presentments landed on very similar and overlapping reasons for why this should be brought against Bishop Ruch, I think speaks a lot to the gravity of what we're working with here, and was really important that the public was able to see that not only does the lay presentment represent this, but also three bishops within this denomination are seeing the same patterns, are thinking that these same things deserve a further look and really do come up against the canons in what kind of violations may have been done here.
And there are enough, at least to me as the outsider viewing it in, there are enough interesting discrepancies, like differences, like, oh, I had not heard this bit before. Before we get into those details, Connor, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, there was one thing in there that was new to me, and I think perhaps new to all of us, which was the kind of inside baseball of what the College of Bishops talked about. And they made clear that the protection policies have been a discussion of theirs for years. And we didn't know that. We didn't know what the bishops discuss, what they talk about, what's on their agendas, what are their common goals or projects they're working on together. And this was clearly one that has been on their plates for quite a while. And they made clear that been talking about this for a while, and Stewart has not taken the proper action for years. That was something really new to me, and it was really good to hear that.
Go ahead, Whitney.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if this was the best place to start discussing this or not, but one thing that was fascinating for me reading through the bishop's presentment was there are especially a couple of key points where they reference when training occurred. I know there's a place where Brenda is quoted talking about the timeline for training. There's a place where she is quoted emailing the then Archbishop about when they did and did not have a policy in place. There's another quote, I believe it's referencing from the Grand River Solutions, but I can't find the exact quote right here at the moment, but it's in there where it's talking about Bishop Ruch and his wife saying that they never received any training on grooming and what that looks like. And that jumped out to me because, I mean, my background, I was at Res for about 10 years all told. I've had friends who've been there for even longer, friends who've been involved in doing a lot of volunteer things and children's stuff. And I know quite a few of them have had training as early as, I want to say 2013 or something. And several of them remember this being involved with Ministry Safe. And they were talking about grooming through all of that. And I've double checked with several of my friends who received that training at Res, and they're like, oh yeah, grooming was one of the things that they covered. And that was fascinating because they're saying not only is like Stewart and Catherine saying that we've not been trained on this, but various people throughout are saying we didn't have a protection policy in place. We didn't know what we were looking for on this. And I feel like when we get down to it, the hair that's going to get split on that is like, well, yeah, Res had a policy, but the diocese didn't have a policy. And that's where that gets covered, that like, well, sure, there were policies in places for individual churches, but like the diocese itself, and that's what we're saying wasn't in place. But that should be a moot point, because so many of the people involved in these situations are directly res adjacent. like everyone in the Rivera situation came out of res at some point. And if res had a protection policy, the fact that the diocese didn't have one doesn't particularly matter there. They should have had that training if they were there.
And this is not from the presentment, but I would like to juxtapose what is exposed in the bishop's presentment through the Grand River Solutions transition report to the current messaging from the Upper Midwest Diocese. If you go to their trial FAQ page, they have a specific question on what is the diocese doing with child protection and safeguarding. And I can quote it directly. They say, since 2013, we have had strong child protection policies. So they are claiming that they've had strong child protection policies and that they're only making them better now. While at the same time, 4 years before, telling Grand River Solutions investigators that we didn't have policies, we didn't know these things. You can't blame us because we just weren't educated about grooming, about spotting abuse, about response. You can't have it both ways. You can't message and assure your congregations that you've had it together for over a decade while also telling investigators it's not our fault, don't blame us, we didn't know.
For the sake of including everything we know about the Diocese of the Upper Midwest policies, here is another excerpt from the recorded meeting with Bishop Ruch in February of 2023 that we featured in the previous episode. Here, one of the anonymous people in the meeting asks Ruch if there is or will be any trauma or abuse training taking place within the diocese.
Yes. The main training that we've redoubled our efforts in right now is all around kind of the new levels and all the new good material that's come out on child protection and grooming. That's the main thrust right now. But we're also committed to developing a sexual abuse response policy, so we can be very, very clear what to expect as somebody comes forward. What does that mean when a survivor comes forward? How do we understand that better? What's happening for them? There's been a lot of trauma-informed consulting and care happening, particularly at Resurrection, because that was one of the things we wanted to learn. But we have a commitment to that continuing to develop, absolutely, and developing wherever we can develop diocesan guidelines around these matters. We've done so now with some really strong standards around child protection. Every church had child protection policies already in place, but we need to have these standards. And we're going to do this. I'm looking at Alyssa, because she's a Bishop's Council member. We want to have these in other areas like sexual abuse response and other places too.
Sure.
Our conversation continues with Connor starting to describe some of the specific details laid out in the bishop's presentment.
I think one of the first things that was significant is they seem to be drawing on the Grand River Solutions report. And that's always been pretty murky and unclear to us what happened to that. Was it passed on to Hush Blackwell incomplete and Hush Blackwell continued it? Was it finalized in some sort of way? None of us have seen it. So it seems there's this other source. I feel like I'm talking about the Q source in the Gospels, right? Like it's like this thing that everybody's postulating, like, yeah, it exists back there. And the writers seem to be drawing on it. It's similar to the Grand River Solutions report, where the bishops are drawing on this, and we've never seen it. So we're all like, well, what's in there? Who was interviewed? What's the contents? What was the scope? What were the questions? We don't know. Yet there seem to be bits of it that show up in this. So that was interesting and new to me.
For the Grand River Solutions, just to remind myself and everybody listening, was this paid for by the province, by the ACNA, or is Grand River Solutions paid for by the UMD?
Yeah, Grand River Solutions, I believe, was paid for by the UMD. And we have never known exactly when it launched and when it was completed and when things transitioned to PRT control, Provincial Response Team control, led by Alan Hawkins. we know when the Hush Blackwell investigation began. That was in early January of 2022. One of the things that you can pull out from this bishop's presentment is found on page 3, and it says, in August of 2021, Ruch admitted to Grand River Solutions that he and his wife Catherine had not had training on grooming behaviors, didn't understand grooming, didn't realize what it was about, how those interactions worked. That is a direct report from the Grand River Solutions transition report. Again, we weren't even aware that there was a report put together and given to the denomination, but it looks like it was. But it's interesting to note that this is quoting August of 2021. Stewart took a leave of absence July 8th of 2021. So Grand River Solutions was still interviewing people, including Stewart and his wife Catherine, in August. So again, I don't have any insider baseball on that. It's one of those big questions where I say, okay, so looking at the timeline, I want to know if Stewart went on leave and the province stepped into, as they messaged it, to take over the investigation of how the Upper Midwest Diocese handled this. We don't know at what point Grand River Solutions ceased their investigation, what material they handed over. That has never been released. The bishop's presentment cites from it, but we don't have it in its completion. And then we don't know at what point that influenced or transitioned into the selection of Hush Blackwell. There are a lot of unanswered questions there.
Yeah, Whitney, go ahead.
I can just say, personally reading through it, one of the first things that jumped out at me was the reference to Bishop Ruch asking his own daughter about any situations of abuse that may have happened to her. So clearly he was taking the situation seriously enough to think that other children may have been at risk. And that was a grace only extended to his own children. Because it was, another year and a half, 2 years after that, as far as we know, that before any other parents in the diocese were alerted that they should maybe talk to their own kids. And that was a gut punch. Because how do you see it for your own kid and then just decide that no one else's kids? Yeah. As a parent, that one was really hard to read. I think that spoke both to he is taking it seriously, but only in one very specific context.
Yep. And ACNA too has privately heard of one other leading individual in the Upper Midwest Diocese who did the exact same thing. And I think I was just as furious then.
Yeah, that was an infuriating detail to me as well. Because again, when I think about the charges that we wrote up with the Minnesota folks in the lay-led presentment, this is a clear violation of his job and his duty as a bishop to care for sheep. It seemed he selectively cared for sheep. And to see that clearly laid out in the bishop's presentment was, in one sense, confirms our charges and our concerns, and is incredibly infuriating.
Yeah, the bishop's presentment brought 2 charges, and the lay-led presentment brought 3. And we did overlap on the one that was bringing just cause for scandal. Is that the wording? But I think it's important to recognize that whereas the bishops also, their second charge was the habitual neglect for the duties of the office, whereas we said violation of ordination vows and disobedience to or willful contravention of the Constitution and canons of the Church. Honestly, when you look at the details that the bishop's presentment uses to back their charges and what the lay-led presentment authors and signatories use to back their charges, there is such an overlap. I kind of read the different, where they landed on which violations to use, and I think, well, it's all coming from the same thing. It's all the same foundational, like, you didn't do what you should have done. Again, what Connor is saying, you didn't shepherd the flock, you didn't protect them. You sought to self-protect instead and blaze forward and image management and not seek to look for lost sheep.
And I get lost on the timelines, and maybe this, I don't know if we want to get into this now, but also continue to bring in people to the diocese and commission them for ministry that have not been properly vetted and have problematic histories and pasts. I think either that speaks to the people coming in, but there's also the question of the greenhouse movement, and the role that that plays. Yeah, who would like to speak to that? Because that's another area of the messaging, the discrepancy. It's you can correct me if I'm wrong. Bishop Stewart has said things like, "Well, the greenhouse wasn't really under me," or like there's just kind of the PR messaging of it. Who can speak to? And I should say this for listeners. For me in my world, I understand what greenhouse is. I mean, I'm so familiar with, hey, we're going to have a church planting initiative. It's like a thing amongst lots of evangelical people. I mean, it was with like kind of like Mars Hill out west with Driscoll. I mean, it's a kind of a phenomenon of the last 20 years. What makes it interesting, particularly with Anglicans, is yeah, but who's in charge of it? Like who's managing this? So, I mean, who can speak to what the bishop's presentment says about that? Okay, yeah, Connor, go ahead.
Can Connor explain what greenhouse is? And maybe, do you remember that video of Beasley that we had way back where he's talking about lay catechists and kind of like he said something like the bishop taps a lay catechist and he starts leading a church, and then he taps him and he becomes a priest, and then he taps him and he becomes a bishop. Do you remember that? He calls it the African model. I don't know if I want to call it that, but do you see what I'm saying? Like there's just that very loose, the hierarchy gets really murky really quickly, and the preparation, it goes out the window.
It speaks to the lay catechist isn't just like some volunteer doing something. Like this is someone who's being brought into this role with the idea that they are headed in a specific direction.
Yeah, they function as rectors. I mean, Zach Stallard, who is named in that like problematic clergy, he was functioning as a rector.
Yeah, so a quick review of Greenhouse for folks. It's a church planting model that was taken after a 19th century African model. That there's some history there in East Africa on the development of lay catechists, and in many ways, really great things. Right, trying to resist the white Western English imposition of structure on cultures that they're completely ignorant of. They rather wanted to have people on the ground who understood the language and culture who could be leaders. And I applaud that. That's a great thing. William Beasley saw it, brought it to Chicago, and it always seemed to me a little more charismatic and chaotic, where people were chosen and they were sent out to lead, right? And everybody knew, okay, you're the leader. You're the one who's directing the service. You're the one I come to for questions about how the service or worship is structured and what we do and when things are scheduled, right? For all intents and purposes, everybody looking in knew that there was some specific person who was a leader. So the fact we call them a lay catechist doesn't mean they have any less functional leadership role in the community. So that's just a quick history on Greenhouse. But what was really confirming and helpful in the bishop's presentment was that they named Greenhouse as first off, they name it as a deanery of the Diocese of the Upper Midwest, right? And let's be really clear here. Any kind of ministry in Anglican polity must fall under a bishop. That's how Anglican polity works. Any kind of ministry work has to be within a diocese, which is under a bishop. So even though this is a separate entity that sends leaders out to plant churches, the functioning of this entity is in different geographical locations and therefore must fall under the authority of some local bishop. And where it started was in the Chicago area, and Stewart and William have a history. And so that's where it began. And Stewart was the bishop there. So it's under his authority. It's as simple as that. And to read that the bishops recognized that and named that was really validating that that's something that Stewart has tried to skirt. He's tried to place the blame on William Beasley solely. And I remember when I was in Greenhouse, I saw the master structure spreadsheet of who reports to who, right? And even in there, it says, here's William Beasley. Who does he report to? Stewart Ruch III. So it's clear in there that even in Greenhouse, they understood that there is a clear line of authority back to Stewart. So to see them name that these lay catechists, ultimately their ministry function, Stewart is responsible for. To see them name that was super validating. And again, something we knew all along, but was really nice to to hear officially from them.
As I hinted at earlier, there's a number of names. These were new to me. Some of them were familiar. Abby, can you speak to elements where they got things wrong, where we had to redact things? How do you want to describe that?
Some of the things that jumped out to me immediately in the presentment were instances where the bishops were working with secondhand information, perhaps from Hush Blackwell, perhaps from reports from UMD leaders. But when they listed out different people in Greenhouse who, for various reasons, were listed as examples of Stewart's failures of leadership. And it was really disheartening, but also not surprising to see that these bishops, the people, whoever wrote the presentment, because we don't actually know who wrote the presentment, really did not have any understanding of power dynamics or the nature of adult clergy sexual abuse. And that is something that we see over and over again, not just in the ACNA, but in church contexts across the spectrum. So much so that we actually just recently published a piece from an expert on the language that we use around adult clergy sexual abuse, because so often what is labeled as an indiscretion or an affair or immaturity is actually sexual abuse and sexual assault. And the way that we label that really matters, because not only, by listing potential victims alongside their abusers, you are not only telling the survivor, we do not believe you. We do not believe what happened to you was abuse. We do not believe that the person who had power over you had any specific responsibility for this. But you're telling the congregations, you're telling the church at large that a priest or another person in leadership can abuse someone that they have power over and get away with it. And we can label as some kind of consensual sin when it can't be, because consent cannot occur where there are those power differentials. Consent only occurs when it's freely given, when it's informed, when it's knowledgeable assent. And you cannot freely give consent if someone has power over you. And the way that power looks can, kind of take different forms. But with the Anglican structures, even within the Greenhouse movement, which played loosey-goosey with hierarchy, there were still authority structures. And sometimes it's as simple as the person who is male gets the power because the UMD has, certain positions about who can hold leadership and the various appendages that are necessary to hold that leadership. Yeah, I think that was really concerning to see that. And that was one of the reasons that we, immediately reached out to the province and said, this needs to be redacted further, because you are harming not only, the survivors, but you are perpetuating false narratives that will harm the church at large.
So to be specific, and I don't know how much you all want to speak to this, one of the examples, and I'm pretty sure you redacted this almost completely, or like it was maybe, I don't know. You can fill me in. And one of the cases that we've looked at a lot so far is Josh Moon. And that, Abby, what you're saying is that was described as some kind of marital infidelity, or, maybe on both sides, right? And what you're saying, Abby, is that wording is dangerous and harmful. Is that correct?
And false.
And false. Yeah.
Yeah. But yes, absolutely dangerous and harmful.
I think to build on that and to make this really clear that there are states who recognize this and have put this into statute. In the state of Minnesota, clergy is what is called a prohibited occupational relationship. So similar to psychotherapists or psychologists, even consensual sexual contact is illegal, because the statute recognizes that there is a particular kind of power difference. There's a particular emotional vulnerability that's created between a clergy and somebody under their care. And so they recognize that consent here is not enough. There is a recognition of power differential, of emotional power over another person, of spiritual authority and power over another person, right? We all recognize these kinds of roles. And whether we want to admit it or not, they have a psychological effect on us. When we see somebody with a collar, it does something to us. When we see something in front of a group of people telling them what to do or leading something, we go, oh, yep, you're the leader. That's the effect on people, whether we give them the name of a particular title or role or whatever or not. And so that's really important here, because in the state of Minnesota, that's the law. And I think that should be particularly damning to the church that the state has recognized this before we have. And they've codified this. And we should recognize that clergy, however that's legally defined, somebody who's leading a service, somebody who's in front of people and guiding them through worshiping as a church, who's supposed to be pointing them to Jesus, has power, whether they know it or not. States have recognized it. Why can't we?
I want to champion the leaders when we can. And I feel like ACNA 2 tends to get the bad reputation of, hey, they are never going to be satisfied, and they're always going to have something to pick on. I loved one statement on the 7th page of the presentment. I'm gonna read it. In this case, Bishop Ruch's conduct was scandalous and offensive, regardless of whether it had ever gained public attention. Oh, I sat with that and I was like, they said it. They said what needed to be said. And that is, it doesn't matter if it causes a public scandal. It doesn't matter if it is just making people look bad. Like, it's a scandal because it is morally wrong, period. And I love that they put that in writing. Now I'm going to have to criticize. And that is that almost immediately after, they said, since June 2021, the diocese and consequently the College of Bishops and the province have suffered criticism on social media and in numerous news articles in regional and national religious and secular media, as well as by the threat of lawsuits. You know what? That is not all on Ruch. Because there could have been a rapid and properly guided, transparent process. There could have been best practice care for survivors. There could have been a thorough, independent, third-party investigation that would have prevented all the bad press. And so people who have paid attention to the podcast and have been on Twitter or Facebook or what have you will understand that I will be the first in line to accuse Ruch of mishandling and not being a good shepherd of the flock. However, the blame for the witness to the watching world does not fall just on Ruch. It falls on every bishop in the ACNA. They could have done a much, much, much better job of responding to and caring for survivors. And they didn't, and they have continued not to.
Well, I've spoken to some bishops. Some bishops have spoken to me. They called me into a meeting, is what I'm trying to say.
That's right.
But a lot of, and I've spoken to one other bishop. I'm not going to say who it was, but a lot of it, the tagline is, we can't do anything, right? Like this, it's not up to us. And so I guess one of the things I'm fascinated with the bishop's presentment myself, and I don't know if this is Anglican. I don't know what this comes down to, but can't the bishops have just actually just sat down with Ruch and had a heart to heart and go, come on, guy, what are we doing here? So instead of hey man, this is really bad. What have you done? And they've made it very relational amongst the bishops. Well, then they write a whole thing. They have all of these independent studies done, which spends hundreds of thousands of dollars. I guess I'm also fascinated with the legal aspect of this, where there could have been some kind of peer-to-peer accountability But I guess that's not how these things work ever. But I just kind of lament that.
Oh no, they do.
Yeah.
They do.
They
We saw
can.
that response just a month and a half ago when Bishop Ray Sutton from the REC Mid-Atlantic Diocese quietly
right.
brought in Calvin Robinson. And within, I think he was maybe licensed for 5 days before social media found out and there was an immediate outcry. And within 48 hours, Archbishop Steve Wood had released a statement of concern. And there were internal College of Bishops reaching out, and all of a sudden the licensure was revoked and it was all over. Those conversations do happen. And they can hold each other accountable. It is a choice. Subsidiarity is often held out in the ACNA. We can't take action because of subsidiarity, meaning like each diocese has their own governance and each bishop can take care of his own and kind of clean up his own house, whatever. They use that at will. They use subsidiarity as an excuse for non-response, and then they use their hierarchy when they do want to respond. And it is absolutely a choice every single time, and we have countless examples of that. They can act as fast as they want or as slowly as they desire.
It's ecclesiastical states' rights. The ACNA functions as a federation of dioceses. The archbishop does not have sole authority to do things in the way that many people would want or perhaps expect or perhaps perceive what he can do. It's really the College of Bishops that can vote, can take action. And like Audrey said, it's based on will. It's based on, do they have the will to do it or not? And in many cases, they want to push things back to the diocese and say, this is subsidiarity. We're not going to handle this. And then in many other cases, they'll say, well, we'll do this top down. But it's never clear when it should be one or the other. It seems very ad hoc.
There's another example of this that is actually highlighted quietly in the bishop's presentment. In their list of problematic clergy in the Upper Midwest Diocese, they mention a man named Keith Hartzell, who was a priest in the Upper Midwest Diocese and also worked through Greenhouse, was one of the supervisors, one of the highest ranking members of Greenhouse. I'm just going to read a quote again from page 7 of the bishop's presentment. It says, Hartzell has not cooperated with the investigations. He continues to misrepresent his conversation with the provincial representatives and has not provided evidence that he has asserted exonerates him. Yet, what we know outside of the presentment, just in the current situation, is that Hartzell was allowed a few years ago to transfer from the Upper Midwest Diocese and Greenhouse to the Diocese of Western Anglicans. He is now currently serving as a rector at Grace Anglican Church in Oceanside, California, and even was able to promote and lead a multi-church youth camp that just completed. I believe it completed last night. So he can refuse to participate in an investigation, and somehow the ACNA is okay with letting him quietly transfer from one diocese to another and continue leading. I mean, does this not echo the Catholic Church abuse that came out in 2002 and has still rocked internationally? It is ridiculous that our denomination can allow a priest to just not participate in an investigation when there are countless reports made against his misconduct. And here he is, a rector in California.
And not only that, but being in charge of camps that involve youth, when some of the allegations against him were how he handled situations involving abuse of youth under his care. It's just
Exactly. I saw a picture last night.
Frankly.
Yeah, right. I saw a picture of his youth camp last night, and my heart just stopped. Do they not care?
Was Keith Hartzell, are there separate investigations about his own conduct, or would he have been only asked about, what do you know about Bishop Ruch's decisions and behavior, or what was the extent of that?
Yeah, we don't know exactly. We have been in contact with survivors who did turn in reports. We have seen those reports, and we have seen the summaries that they were given from Teleos Law for a number of those cases. So there were allegations made against him for, as Whitney said, mishandling, child sexual abuse, allegations about his own misconduct, sexual harassment, bullying, manipulation, financial coercion, verbal abuse. There were numerous accounts. And so he was actually asked to participate both in the Hush Blackwell investigation as well as the Telios investigation. Hush Blackwell was simply doing investigation into the mishandling, the alleged mishandling of sexual abuse. So he was interviewed, and I think that's toward the end of the Hush Blackwell report where you see some things that he told Hush Blackwell, but then it sounds from the bishop's presentment that he was not able to substantiate it and then refused to participate. I do have in writing that the Telios investigation, which was supposed to specifically investigate abuses of ecclesiastical power, Keith Hartzell refused to participate in that at all, and Telios put that in writing. So that's where you would have seen, I would guess, most of the reports that were the bullying, manipulation, perhaps sexual harassment, financial coercion. Those would have gone to Telios, and he would not participate. And yet he is serving as a rector and running a youth camp.
As we move through the bishop's presentment, are there any other independent cases of Ruch's handling of clergy or leaders or lay catechists or whoever that you want to talk about? I see you mentioned Joel Gerard here. Anybody else that you want to bring up and help clarify and bring into the light for people to understand? I think the thing about this, and I've had this problem from the beginning, is there's just information overload. Actually, you know what? I'll bring this into it. I'm really big into contemporary Christian music, and I've been watching what's been happening with Michael Tate of the Newsboys and the DC Talk, and I was reading a new report, and even in that report, there was like 5 people, and I'm like going like, who's this guy, and what's this guy doing here, and this guy, and it was just confusing. So how can you help to bring into the light and in clarity what's in the bishop's presentment? What else is there? Anything else that we haven't gotten to yet?
The Joel Gerard piece, you mentioned his name. It has numerous factual inaccuracies in the bishop's presentment. It is not, I'm not going to place the blame on the bishops. They were working from the material that they had, which was largely from the Hush Blackwell investigation. However, the Hush Blackwell investigators did not speak to the victim. They spoke to the peripheral clergy who helped deal with and respond to the situation. If the ACNA had set up a safe, again, independent third-party investigation, if they had been willing to show the contract with the investigators, if they had been willing to answer really important questions about how they were going to protect survivors' identities and personal information, what evidence they would put publicly out, if they had been able to answer those questions, you would have had a lot more survivors participating in this investigation. And so what ACNA 2 knows and what is published in the bishop's presentment is it's erroneous, and it has inaccuracies that I wish would be corrected. Again, it's on the ACNA. They can have a good process if they want one. The only other thing that I think I would share, there is a quote that is found in the bishop's presentment that is a direct quote from the Grand River Solutions Transition Report, which again, we have never seen. And this is what it says. Had there been better training and education for church leadership and staff, it's possible that the signs would have been noted years before the first vulnerable person fell prey to Rivera's misconduct. And I think that's important to note, that the professionals in the room who were investigating initially before the province then hired Hush Blackwell actually drew that conclusion, that harm could have been prevented. Hush Blackwell, by contract, they stated in their introduction and in their conclusion that they were not allowed to draw any professional evaluation of the information that they gathered. They were basically hired to interview and put those interviews into narrative form. It appears that Grand River Solution was able to draw a few evaluatory conclusions and present their concerns. And I think that is important to highlight, that, look, they did draw a conclusion that Rivera's abuse was very likely preventable.
I was going to add, I think it's important to name that, I don't think anybody here, and by here I mean the ACNA, the Upper Midwest, wants abuse to happen, but emoting about it and expressing your feelings about it is not the same thing as setting up policy and guardrails and structures against it. We can all express our strong emotions against abuse. That's fine. But doing something about it is completely different. And we have to have the will to do something about it. And what I see in the bishop's presentment is a confirmation that no matter what Stewart has said about abuse, no matter what leaders say about abuse, there seems to be no real action for years on setting something up to prevent it, to train people.
I think that goes back to theology. We can go even deeper than a lack of prioritizing policymaking and safeguarding. We need to go back to examine the theology of restoration, a theology of protection. Chris, you really unpacked this really well in your last episode. I'm talking about, is it episode 12? The second presentment episode, where you said making churches safe. That can be really interpreted as a good or a bad thing. But I think the ACNA needs to stop and really closely examine what are our beliefs about harm? What are our beliefs about protection of the most vulnerable? And when I say vulnerable, I mean any person, child or adult, who has the virtue of trusting and believing that the person in front of them has their best intentions. In other words, a vulnerable person is not just some broken person out there who's at risk because they just lack the faculties to spot harm and run from it. Joanna Rudenberg, who is Mark Rivera's oldest known survivor, has this amazing Twitter thread that talks about how abusers use the best parts of you in their harm. So a person who is very trusting, a person who listens well, a person who is sympathetic, people who care, abusers use that. That is your vulnerability. And so I would love to see the ACNA or any church stop and examine, how do we truly make our churches safe? We can extend grace to all, but we're going to have to become more creative. We're going to start to think outside of the box. We can bring church to these individuals, but there are individuals out there who, for their own safety, should not be in a community with children, perhaps not even a community with people whom they could prey upon. You can still bring church to them when everybody's informed, when you carefully construct a safe environment. Keeping churches safe should not be something we make fun of or cliche. It is simply what shepherding is for a flock of God-imaged humans.
I think somewhere along the line, we've gotten this conflation that forgiveness means restoration to power, whereas you can be forgiven and never have power again. And you don't prove your forgiveness by having your power returned to you. Sometimes you just do forfeit that. And that's okay. That doesn't mean God doesn't love you. That doesn't mean your community doesn't love you. You can still be just as much a part of the body of Christ, whether or not you are in a position of leadership and power. And sometimes that's just not something that's ever going to come back. And that's not bad. That is, if you truly do consider yourself a shepherd for your people, that is what shepherding looks like for you in that moment, is to willingly lay down your authority because you have done something that makes you no longer qualified to hold it in this setting. And again, that doesn't make you any less a child of God. That doesn't make you any less a part of the body of Christ. That is a consequence for an action and a part of being your people's shepherd. Like, if you want to come back to living into that role, that's what it looks like for you right now, is the shepherd lays down his life for his sheep. Like, that's what you've got to do. And somewhere we've conflated it that you have to be able to go back to having everything that you had in order to prove that you've received forgiveness. Because if you don't have all of that, somehow God's forgiveness isn't real. And that's just not how that's never been how God's love works. It's unconditional. And you don't have to have all the trappings to prove that you, if that makes sense. I feel like I'm not saying that in the most clear way that I could.
No, that's good. I think sometimes being a good shepherd is recognizing you're not a good shepherd.
Mm-hmm.
And like, that just takes humility.
Maybe a connection point, and it's a reflection on my own church upbringing, which was in the Pentecostal charismatic world, and I see a lot of overlap here, and it kind of is encapsulated in that part that made you all so irate and just distraught was when he asked about his own children, and actually one of the thoughts that I had, like, hey, did he do anything to you? Is I imagined Bishop Stewart thinking about that in his own kids, while also having that list that's in both presentments, and it's like, I part of me was like, oh man, like maybe he doesn't do that. I don't know. I mean, it's all speculation, but yeah, you're definitely concerned about what might have happened or might not have happened to your own kid. But there's also like 12 guys that like I'm dealing with all these problems all at once. I guess what I'm trying to say is I think leadership is really, really tricky. And I really feel for most all leaders anywhere. I'm also at the point where I'm really skeptical of all leaders because I think that they're kind of just there to puff themselves up sometimes. And there's something in that list of like there's this guy and there's this incident and it's like and they're all people that he commissioned, all people that he brought into the diocese or approved. Let's just use a really general word, approved in some way. And so yeah, sure he's concerned about his own kid, but how is he handling the 12 disasters that are looming outside of him? I guess maybe my connection point is growing up Pentecostal charismatic is we moved in the spirit. And so if you got a good feeling about a guy, you're like, yeah, I know a guy. This guy says he loves God. He's had his life transformed. Woo! Let's bring him in. They're going to lead this ministry or whatever. I experienced that so much growing up. That really makes me stop in my tracks. That's kind of one of the reflections there, which is there's an element like Whitney, you're talking about like this incredibly difficult, like you might be redeemed and you're saved and you're brought into God's people, but that doesn't mean you get a leadership position. I'm pondering that because I grew up with that so much, and I'm kind of reassessing like how wise were some of those decisions of people that were brought into ministry. Anyway, that's my own reflection.
Yeah, and I think that prompts it should prompt in the American church reflection on just what a leader is and where we're drawing our source of what a leader should be or shouldn't be. And oftentimes it just comes from the entrepreneurial business world and organization management. And that's it, sprinkled with some Bible verses. So
if they increase revenues, they're good, right?
Right. Like
increase market share.
Increase market share, yeah. Or you get, you come up with abbreviations like ASA, actual Sunday attendance, like things like that. Like we're coming up with these data points or these concepts that, like, again, draw from the business entrepreneurial world, organizational management world, and we really need to ask the question of how much of this is appropriate in the church, and what makes a good. Should we even use the word leader? I don't know. I ask myself that question all the time. Like, should we even use the word leader? I think about people I know who have been up for election for a bishop and they didn't want to be bishop. And I think we need more bishops like that. But again, then I think we should explore, well, why do we want somebody who doesn't want to be a bishop? Why is that important and good, as opposed to somebody who has a great resume and experience in the private sector and the public sector or whatever? There's a whole conversation we need to have about what is a leader in church.
As many of us anticipate Bishop Ruch's trial, its outcome, and whatever the aftermath of it may bring, I I want to offer a song for us to reflect on. Sandra McCracken's Fool's Gold, from her album Songs from the Valley. It's a meditation on how to keep living with hope for redemption in a world when so much about it is broken, incomplete, and devastatingly unjust. In the second verse, she mentions the children and how they're now living a life more complicated, but their smiles are still in bloom. I realized this song was most likely written in response to McCracken's own divorce, which she was going through at the time, and the effects it had on her and her family. But as I listened to it this week, it hit me how it could also apply to a little girl who was sexually abused by a church leader and who has had to live with that in the years since. How she was bold enough to tell her mom about it, and how her life is now far more complicated than it otherwise would have been. But that also, because of her, so much wrong has been brought out into the light, and now others will be protected because of her bravery.
Kids are laughing in the other room, her life more complicated. Their smiles are still in bloom, they're on their own. Take them by the hand, the best we can. We give them love, give them love. But if it's not okay, then this is not the end, and this is not okay. So I know this is not the The fog is coming clear now, and I am waking up. The light brings out the shimmer of what is fool's gold, what is love. What was fool's gold, what is love.
The song itself is worth sitting with, and even listening to repeatedly. But I just wanted everyone to know that if it's not okay, it's not the end. No matter what happens in this trial, no matter what happens in the ACNA, whether you're inside of it or you decided to leave it, if it's not okay, it's not the end.
This is not okay. So I know it is not the end.
As stated before, our next episode will continue our look into the presentment trial through a conversation with Sam Lacey, a lawyer and one of the authors of the lay-led presentment. If you believe in what the Wall of Silence podcast is trying to accomplish, please consider supporting it through our Patreon page at patreon.com/Wall of Silence podcast. Though I am not always able to offer extra material, this month we do have an episode featuring Megan Tucker and Audrey Lumen. I invite you to check out the Patreon page and see if you want to become a monthly supporter. I appreciate all of you who are already doing that and helping to make this podcast possible. The Wall of Silence podcast is produced and edited by me, Chris Marchand. I also record the music, and our artwork is by Alice Mitchlick. You can find her other work or commission a piece through her Instagram account, Mouthful of Stars. Please rate and review the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or whatever service you listen on. You can find a link to the transcript of this episode, including related article links, in the show notes. Finally, I'd like to give a special thanks to the birds outside of Audrey's window. You contributed a tremendous amount of wonder and peace to this episode, and that there is beauty and newness of life outside of this often enraging madness we currently find ourselves in.